Changing a country isn't easy, but change is inevitable. And the choices we make today will shape our country for generations to come. That's why we've published our first book from Australia Institute Press. What's the Big Idea offers 32 ideas for a better Australia, from leading thinkers such as Bob Brown, Sally McManus, Dr Emma Shortis, and Professor Brian Schmidt. The essays are a roadmap and a reminder that the solutions exist. Australia just needs the courage to implement them. Visit australiainstitute.org.au or follow the link in the show notes to order your copy of What's the Big Idea today.
After America is made on the lands of the Kure-Wurrung, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. We acknowledge that they and their ancestors have cared for the lands, rivers and sea, and all living creatures for thousands of generations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Welcome to After America. I'm Dr Emma Shortis, Director of International and Security Affairs at the Australia Institute. This week, Donald Trump continued his assault on the rule of law, at home and internationally.
The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip, and we will do a job with it, too. We'll own it.
You cut to the chase. You see things others refuse to see. You say things others refuse to say.
We have an opportunity to do something that could be phenomenal. And I don't want to be cute. I don't want to be a wise guy, but the Riviera of the Middle East, this could be something that could be so bad. This could be so magnificent.
You are the greatest friend Israel has ever had in the White House.
Alongside his threats to annex Canada, Panama, Greenland and take over Gaza, which are all clearly illegal, Trump and his unelected and unaccountable friends, like Elon Musk, are also busy creating a constitutional crisis at home. The Trump administration's so-called pause on all US foreign aid and its dismantling of USAID is likely unconstitutional and probably breaks a bunch of other laws, but they don't care. In fact, this week, Vice President JD Vance tweeted that judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power, which pretty much suggests that Trump can just ignore judges and do what he wants. That all seems like a pretty big problem. Not, apparently, to the Australian government. Late last week, Australian Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister Richard Marles met with the newly confirmed US Secretary of Defence Pete Hegseth. He told Secretary Hegseth that Australia welcomes a very significant increase of the American footprint on the Australian continent and handed over $798 million Australian dollars to the US naval shipbuilding industry. On Monday, we got our reward. On Air Force One, on the way to the Super Bowl, Trump announced new 25% tariffs on steel and aluminium. As far as we know, there's no carve-out for Australia. Everything's going great. To talk about Trump in the world and at home and how allies are responding to him, I'm really pleased to introduce a new guest. Matt Duss is the Executive Vice President of the Centre for International Policy, a think tank based in Washington, D.C. Before joining CIP, Matt was a visiting scholar in the American Statecraft program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. From 2017 to 2022, he was foreign policy advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders. Here's Matt now. Matt, thank you so much for joining us on After America.
My pleasure. Great to see you. Great to be with you.
It's great to see you too after what I'm sure has been a pretty horrendous week for you. And I think that's probably where we should start. I wanted to really begin by asking you how you sum up what Donald Trump has said he wants to do in Gaza.
Yeah, well, I mean, I will use a cliche. I'm not the first person to say it. Others are saying it, but not just on Gaza, but the whole range of things he started doing, which is shock and awe, which is he's moving very quickly. He's moving in some places I think a lot of people didn't expect, unleashing Elon Musk and his little, Oompa Loompas on USAID and the Treasury and other things like that. But yeah, Gaza was, from Trump himself, I think one of the most, shocking things we heard. And as with Trump, it's always a challenge to kind of separate the signal from the noise. But I do think just the way that Trump has now made it, official U.S. policy to support ethnic cleansing, to support, what international law recognizes as a crime against humanity. We really need to understand it in those terms. And we really cannot pretend that this is just some other policy option already. I always tend to be disappointed by, the American political media establishments and the foreign policy establishment's response, but how too many people are treating this as like a kind of a provocative outside the box response. And it may be that, you can point to lots of things that you could categorize as provocative outside the box responses, but it is a crime against humanity. And we really need to speak about it in those blunt terms.
He's a big thinker and a deal maker.
Well, I've said before that I don't intend to have a running commentary on the President of the United States' statements.
I don't believe that the Americans have any intent to act outside of international law. I don't think the President, from what I've seen, is talking about forcibly moving people.
Australia's position is the same as it was this morning, as it was last year, and it was 10 years ago, and it was under the Howard government. The Australian government support, and a bipartisan basis, a two-state solution in the Middle East.
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, a lot of the media reaction in Australia has been quite similar. I've had the opposition leader describe Trump as a big thinker, I think was the description.
Yeah, tremendous, yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you as well, given your significant expertise in the area, about reactions from outside the United States to Trump's suggestion, especially from within Israel.
Yeah, you have, the Israeli far right, the settlers, the elements of the current governing coalition, Bezalel Smotrich and Ben Gvir, who are just over the moon about this. Benjamin and Netanyahu, of course, praised it. He was going to praise pretty much anything Trump said, but I think he was especially, if you watch the video, it's actually pretty wild. Netanyahu is trying to hide his kind of surprise, but he's almost like, I can't believe this is happening. But of course, he's going to welcome it, not least because he wants to keep the focus on, mistreating the Palestinians, but also we're not talking about the ceasefire now. That's also important. The White House meeting was supposed to focus on moving from phase 1 to phase 2 and then phase 2 to 3 of the ceasefire agreement that was made a few weeks ago. And everyone is talking about something else now. Now, for his own far right partners who were outraged about the ceasefire, he has now been able to give them something. So that kind of solidifies his governing coalition for the time being. And that's, understand Netanyahu's priority 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is his own political survival. If he needs to stay in government to avoid going to jail, he's been, the focus of an ongoing corruption investigation, indictments, but, he's been able to kind of slow walk the process, which could change once he leaves government. So he absolutely, staying in government, staying in power is existential in terms of his own political career and his own personal freedom.
And he very effectively waited for Trump. He waited out the election.
Oh, right. And he was helped by by President Joe Biden, who, which is, we really need to, there's a whole lot of things we need to understand about the Biden administration's policy over the past 15 months of this catastrophic war. But one of the things that I think really is just baffling, and I think will baffle future historians, is how Joe Biden essentially burned his entire legacy, helping to resurrect the political career of this, grubby crook, Benjamin Netanyahu. But that is, in fact, what we just saw over the past 15 months.
And I know you've spoken about this before, but do you think there's an argument that Biden didn't just burn his own political career, but put American democracy at risk as well?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I don't think there's evidence to say that Gaza itself was determinative, but I do think we can safely say that Gaza was among a whole set of issues that showed that, that Democrats just didn't have answers for a whole bunch of constituencies of voters in the United States: young people, Arab Americans, Black Americans, others. Minority voters voted for Trump in greater numbers. I'm not going to say they made their decision based on the conduct of the Gaza war, But I do think that the support for Israel during this war, even in the face of clear violations of international law, clear atrocities over many months, Biden and the Democratic Party, and then Harris, who refused to distance herself really at all from Biden's policies, ended up presenting themselves as defenders of a broken status quo, a set of institutions and organizations and procedures and norms that many Americans, a majority of Americans, I think we can say now, simply no longer believe in and are willing to kind of cast their vote for a disruptor, even one as reckless and dangerous as Donald Trump. And that itself is a huge indictment of the Biden administration and of the Democrats.
Yeah, it absolutely is. Does that mean, Matt, that you can make the argument that what Trump is suggesting, as horrifying as it is not a huge departure from the longer history of US policy toward Israel?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, and I think there's a lot of truth to it. I published a piece in Foreign Policy magazine just yesterday about the Gaza proposal, and one of the things I noted, and I'll note here, is watching a U.S. president and an Israeli prime minister stand there and presume to determine the future of the Palestinian people, to just throw out ideas that are going to result in mass suffering, that are going to essentially diminish, if not outright destroy, Palestinians' search for self-determination, without a Palestinian in the room, without a Palestinian probably within anywhere near there, let alone any Palestinian substantive input, unfortunately does represent a form of continuity in American foreign policy. Certainly American policy toward the Middle East, has not always, Americans have engaged with the Palestinians in certain ways, but it has always essentially been a set of ideas cooked up between the United States and Israel, consulting with the Palestinians, sometimes more, sometimes less. But, the relationship that really does determine life and death issues for the Palestinians, those are consultations that occur between the United States and Israel. And I saw that reflected in the press conference in the White House the other day.
Absolutely. But of course, this potentially at least has huge reverberations in the broader region. What do you think? I mean, what do you make of the reaction so far from Arab nations, from Egypt, from Saudi Arabia, and how do you think this potentially affects relations more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, Egypt and Jordan made clear once again that they were not into this idea at all. They understand that they would be the countries most likely expected to accept this massive influx of, hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees. And for some similar, but some differing regions, they can't deal with that. They cannot politically sustain that. They cannot materially sustain that in their countries. And also we saw Saudi Arabia at, I think it was 4 a.m. local time, put out, a really strong statement saying this is unacceptable. We are still supportive of a two-state solution as a precondition for any kind of peace and normalization agreement with Israel. And I think that's important, but the question also is, okay, how much is Trump going to push on this? Because if he decides this is a priority for him, of course, the United States has a lot of tools of pressure to use on these countries in the region if Trump really wants to make this a priority.
The fact that nobody has a realistic solution and he puts some very bold, fresh, new ideas out on the table, I don't think should be criticized in any way. I think it's going to bring the entire region to come with their own solutions.
Gaza right now has unexploded munitions, lots of rockets and weapons and other things that Hamas was using there, and that needs to be dealt with. And it's very difficult to do that when you have populations on top of you.
We've also seen, in the wake of that, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz was out on TV saying, well, this was just a way to try to jumpstart new ideas. So we did see kind of a walk back. But, Trump's tendency is almost always just to double down. So who knows who to believe. There was this idea, part of the whole proposal was, we're going to send U.S. troops there to help manage this reconstruction. Which, I mean, again, I don't think that's ever going to happen, especially Trump is someone who claims he wants to end war. So the idea that we're going to send U.S. troops in there to serve, to what would clearly be a violent insurgency. I mean, we know that Hamas continues to exist in large numbers. I think one of his last public speaking engagements, former Secretary of State Blinken said that Hamas had been able to replenish its fighters as fast as Israel had been killing them. Again, something that was predicted, something that was many people understood. This is unfortunately how these kinds of insurgencies work. But that's the situation. So I think they'll back off that. But I do think just trying to keep focused on the signal, again, rather than the noise. The issue here is that Trump has now normalized the idea of mass population transfer, ethnic cleansing, as just another policy option. And that is something I really think we must not go along with.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the way it, breaks what is left, I suppose, of the international rule of law is really frightening. And the reaction to it has not been, especially I think the external reaction to it has not been particularly heartening.
No, I mean, you see, the usual statements of, well, we don't really like this from Europe, some stronger, some weaker. But again, the question is, okay, what are you going to do about it? I mean, and this is, again, for understandable reasons, given that he does hold grudges, given that Trump has been very willing to use America's own kind of global financial hegemony in a very vindictive way against countries whose governments displease him. It's understandable that we're not going to see as an aggressive pushback as we might want.
Yeah, and maybe we can come back to that actually. But before we do, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about Trump's foreign policy, if we can call it that, more broadly to put this in a bit more context. You mentioned USAID earlier and the pause on funding, which is something that I think, we're aware of in Australia, but the significance of it, I think, is not really understood. So I wondered if you could take us through how big a deal that is. It feels like a big deal.
Yeah, it is. I mean, USAID has, it runs point for America's development and aid and democracy promotion and civil society support efforts around the world. And it's not just, it helps diminish disease, it helps diminish deprivation, it supports efforts in countries among people who are trying to do this for their own people. I think that's really important. As with any large, and let's understand what we're talking about, the overall American foreign aid budget is a fraction of 1% of the U.S. budget. That is what we're talking about here. So, and the U.S. budget is huge. But of course, with any kind of project that is spending hundreds of millions of dollars, you can find 4 or 5 or 6 kind of dumb sounding things that, I don't want to reel them off, but sure. And they have done that. They've been like, why are we funding, poetry readings in, the Southern Philippines? I don't even know if that's a thing, but just an example of, and I'm sure those poetry readings are great. It's important. People should read poetry. I'm strongly supportive of that. But I think it's a fair question for Americans to ask, okay, great, poetry's good. Why should I pay for it in the Southern Philippines? But that's a way of just kind of legitimizing the overall project, which is like, this is wasteful. And the response here should be, well, what about this is why Americans won't get typhus? This is why Americans, this is why a lot of these diseases will not spread in these different regions and potentially jump on a plane and come back to the United States. I think there is a good, and we should be able to make these kinds of national interest arguments just on the basic sense, like, fighting disease and deprivation globally makes us all safer. It makes Americans safer. It makes Australians safer. I think there's an argument we have to make. And I do see, and I'm disappointed in even some Democrats who are out there saying, well, we're cutting, we're destroying USAID and China's going to benefit. China, and it's like, well, USAID, that's really not the argument you want to lead with. Okay. I really think we need to be making an argument how, our security and our safety is really interconnected rather than treating USAID as a tool of strategic competition, which unfortunately tends to affirm every sort of conspiracy theory about what USAID really is.
Yeah, it does. It speaks to the way that we understand security generally, doesn't it? And, I do wonder if part of what Trump, you called him a disruptor earlier, maybe what Trump disrupts unintentionally is how we think about security. Given that Trump is so actively a threat to security, broadly understood, in terms of the attacks on USAID, in terms of climate, in terms of health. Do you think there's a potential for that kind of reframing or a forced reframing?
I mean, I think there is. It's an interesting question. I'm glad you brought it up because, Trump, and this is going back to 2016, I mean, Trump demonstrated that a lot of Americans have a huge set of questions about what we've treated as the consensus, whether it's the foreign policy consensus, the economic consensus, the domestic political consensus. There is a huge audience and a huge constituency of voters who are like, this isn't working for us. And in his way, Bernie Sanders did the same thing, albeit in I think, a more constructive and unifying way. But to say, like, this consensus is shared by elites only, or at least primarily, and working people, communities across the country have real questions and concerns about it. And I think Trump has given voice to that. And I think we need to take that seriously. I think some people took it seriously, and after 2016, I mean, the whole approach to, foreign policy for the middle class, creating the post-neoliberal agenda, I think those were important steps, and they represented an acknowledgement that Trump kind of was onto something. It's not like he invented this critique. Others have been making this critique for a long time. Ironically, this was a similar critique that drove the kind of late 90s, early 2000s ultra-globalization movement, the protests against the WTO, World Bank, IMF, Seattle and DC and elsewhere around the world. And it took a while for that message to land. But I do think when you combine the Iraq War, when you combine the global financial crisis, the anger at the fact that none of these bankers were held accountable and millions of Americans lost their homes, that reverberated across the world, powered the far right. So there was an effort to kind of say, what did we get wrong? What have we missed? And so the moment now, getting to your question, is I think we do need to think about not just, treat everything Trump is doing just with blanket opposition. I do think we need to strongly oppose a lot of what he's doing, but we do need to think about, okay, why is he able to simply dismantle USAID with very little real public outcry? Because Americans do, at least, they share a lot of these questions. Why am I spending money on this? How does this help my family? How does it help my community? Now, I think there are good answers to those questions, as we just discussed earlier. I mean, a lot of stuff that USAID does really does benefit. It prevents things from happening to American communities. But that's a somewhat harder argument to make. But I do think, people who support positive global engagement, we do need to be ready to have those conversations and debates and answer those questions on the part of Americans who have them.
Yeah, of course, because there are clear reasons why Trump was able to so successfully market himself as the anti-war candidate. But I think it's really important because that is, I think, often uncritically accepted that Trump is anti-war, and he's often, of course, as well described as an isolationist. But I mean, I don't think he's either of those things.
He's not. No, no, he's absolutely not. But the fact that he was, as you said, able to present himself as the anti-war candidate again is an indictment of the Democrats' message. They left that lane wide open for him. Kamala Harris was out there bragging about how we would have the most lethal military in the world. And Americans, that's not what they're looking for right now. Sure, they want a military that keeps them safe, but they also have real questions about these kind of long-term global military interventions. And the Democrats simply were not interested, it seemed, in engaging on those questions. And Donald Trump, especially in the last weeks of the campaign, I mean, there's data on this and reporting on this. They really leaned in to a more anti-war message. Now, as we know from the first term, that's not how Trump operates. His unpredictability and recklessness did, in fact, bring us to the brink of war several times with North Korea, with Iran, and other places. But yeah, that's an issue on which Democrats more or less abandon the field to him. That's a conversation, that's something Democrats need to fix. But getting back to the question you asked about, Trump disrupting and challenging the consensus. And I mean, we really need to be asking the question, and I hate this analogy, but I will use it, like, what is baby and what is bathwater? In terms of what do we need to preserve? Because there are definitely things we should preserve. I mean, there are elements not just of democracy, but of the so-called international rules-based order, such as it is. I mean, these institutions, the basic premise, often honored only in the breach, is the idea that there should be a set of rules that states observe, and the international systems should not be ordered by the principle that might makes right. I think that's a good idea. I think that leads to a better, more safer, and more prosperous world. But we've seen that we have a lot of work to do to kind of make that argument to our fellow citizens.
One of the scary parts is our Pentagon has a perfect record in the last 10 to 15 years in war games against China. They do these sophisticated war games. We lose every time. We lose every time because China's building a military built to defeat the United States.
We welcomed the Chinese Communist Party into the global order, and they took advantage of all of its benefits, and they ignored all of its obligations and responsibilities. Instead, they have repressed and lied and cheated and hacked and stolen their way into global superpower status, and they have done so at our expense and at the expense of the people of their own country.
I think one of the areas where that is most difficult, at least viewed from the outside, is around that idea potentially of great power competition that we mentioned earlier, and particularly the United States approach to China. Because, while Trump so successfully marketed himself as anti-war, or perhaps more accurately, his administration, his cabinet's view on China seems very consistent with that kind of establishment view that you outlined earlier around the maintenance of American primacy. So I wanted to ask you your thoughts on, the kind of ideological makeup of the cabinet there and what that might mean for US-China relations.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have, I would say 3 factions. Some people say 4, but I'm just going to go with 3 right now. One is you have I'd say the primacists, kind of more traditional, the idea that American power is awesome and magical, and it can and must be maintained and sustained everywhere all the time. You've got I would say the prioritizers, who are the people who think we're wasting time and energy in places like the Middle East. We need to refocus, and in Europe, we need to refocus on the China threat. But that, again, is aimed at, they just see that as the necessary move to sustain American global primacy. So their end goal is the same. Then you have the restrainers, who there are a few that have gotten in at, I don't know of any at senior levels, but there are some interesting folks who have gotten in at somewhat lower levels, but still important, who just, they understand America's overstretched our primary. We need to be thinking in a much more limited way about what resources and capital we can expend to support American security and prosperity. Again, I do not use the term isolationist. I don't think anybody, I think that's kind of just a term that the foreign policy establishment uses. It's an epithet used to kind of police the debate. It is not, I think, analytically truthful at all. It's just a pejorative that people kind of throw around when they'd rather not have the debate. So those are kind of the 3 trends that I see right now in the administration.
Yeah, sure. I mean, for what it's worth, I think that's a completely accurate reflection. But one of the people who is not technically in the cabinet, but who is having a huge influence on the United States' role in the world is, of course, Elon Musk as well. And, there's so much to get into there, and we're running out of time. But I did specifically want to ask you about Musk's role or the role he's attempting to play in other democracies and in facilitating the rise or the re-rise of the far right, particularly in places like Germany and the UK. That's particularly concerning viewed from Australia, because we will have a federal election sometime in the next few months. And really, I just wanted to ask you kind of how concerning you think that is, that Musk is playing that kind of international role.
It's very concerning when you have someone with this much wealth, the richest man in the world, a multi-billionaire, who, I mean, the money, he can spend so much money boosting these groups, and it's basically a rounding error for him. This is how much money we're talking about. It is really pretty staggering. And, even though these other democracies are not as blatantly corrupt as the United States is, money really still matters. And then you've also got you've got a number of trends ongoing here. You've got the far right that he's spoken, outright in support of the AfD in Germany, which is one of the farthest right parties in developed democracies. You've got the kind of engagement of Benjamin Netanyahu, who is always available to kind of hand out these anti-Semitism waivers to right-wingers. Like, this is what he did for Musk, right after
to
Musk
a literal Nazi salute.
A Nazi salute, and the next day, Netanyahu was right there on point, Johnny on the spot, putting out a statement, nope, I know Elon Musk, not an anti-Semite. And this is what he's done this is kind of, part of how his strategy for creating relationships, this is what he offers to these groups in exchange for their support for his own political project. And this happens in the United States as well. And it's really gross, but unfortunately it is really effective. And I think the answer to it is, and I've said, we have to keep pushing, we have to keep saying this, is that this is why we need much more energetic, much better coordination, conversation, and engagement between social democratic forces in all of our countries, Germany, Australia, the United States. I mean, we are so far behind the curve in the conversations we need to be having about principles of democracy, equality, anti-corruption, that we really need to play a lot of catch up, but it's absolutely imperative to do so.
Yeah. I think, Matt, that probably leads me to my final question. We talked a little bit about the response from the rest of the world to the Trump administration. So I did want to ask you, how you think, particularly historic allies of the United States like Australia, can more effectively, I suppose, respond to Trump. And to go to your last point, how we might actually go about building that kind of, I guess, democratic solidarity that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean,
it's not an easy question.
Game.
Sorry,
no, it's not. It's a I mean, you want to get other countries in trouble. I mean, I'll just, for you, a personal example, like in the piece that I wrote in response to Trump's Gaza comments. I don't imagine that he would read it or his people would care to share it with him. But Trump's idea of redeveloping Gaza is actually a great one. Gaza should be redeveloped. It's the Palestinians who should redevelop it. Mm-hmm. And if he wants to build a Trump Tower and a Trump casino and a Trump golf course in Gaza, which is actually quite beautiful, which he is correct, it is beautiful territory. I would love to encourage that part of the proposal. I want to leave out the mass atrocity part of it, right? So I guess, identifying some of what Trump says that could potentially be good and constructive. Like, yes, actually a new nuclear agreement with Iran could be really good. President Trump should do that, and he should know that he'll have support if he does that. Mm-hmm. A peace agreement in Ukraine, if the details are correct, if it protects Ukraine's sovereignty and independence and democracy and doesn't simply make, Ukraine a satellite of Russia, that'd be a great deal if he wants to get it. And, and with anything with Trump, it always has to kind of redound to the ultimate greatness of Donald Trump. And if that's the argument that one needs to make to the emperor to get him to do good things, then, I guess that's how we need to frame these proposals, but also at the same time, making clear that, all these other things that you are proposing to do, we're going to continue to oppose, with everything we have.
Yeah, it would be a start, and hopefully, I suppose it's something that we can hope for and continue to push for. But in the meantime, Matt, thank you so much for your time and your generosity.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
This episode was recorded on Friday, the 7th of February. No doubt a bunch of stuff will have changed since then. If you're enjoying After America, please leave us a rating and review on your podcast platform of choice. We'd love to hear from you. You can reach out to us on social media. We are at the Oz Institute, that's with an AUS, on Twitter and Instagram, and at australiainstitute.org.au on Blue Sky. And you can send us feedback and maybe episode ideas via our email address, which is podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation and produced by Angus Blackman. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. We'll be back next week. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.